All right, hey out there. I think we should be live now. The stream should be working, and I might even have everything in place. Okay, switch back to camera mode. Anyway, just welcome. I want to say hi to everybody, and then I'm gonna go through the Q&A questions that are already posted. And if you guys have other stuff that you want to ask, just feel free to drop it in the chat. I also mentioned if you saw the other email, I'm doing another like a wider Q&A call that's just public about MMO development. It's not just Q&A. I'm going to talk about MMO development. Sorry, I got a bunch of fake snow on me from a little Christmas tree. I'm going to talk about a bunch of MMO development stuff, the process, and some interesting things about it, and then take a bunch of questions on it. So if you're interested in that, it'd be like almost immediately after that. I put it for like 12:10, so I have enough time to hit all the questions and then take a short little break and then jump over. Anyway, let's dive over. I'm just gonna show my desktop real quick and go through the questions that are new, and then see if I can answer them all real quick. So the newest stuff that appeared, the first one, which I mentioned in the chat, by the way, or sorry, in the email, was about the tutorial system. I thought it was pretty interesting, just the building a tutorial system in game and setting stuff up so that it's easy to do. I think a lot of the time, almost every time I've seen games developed, the tutorial system is like an afterthought, and people go, "Oh no, we need to add a tutorial system because somebody's not understanding these things," and it's not really well thought out, and it's not easily hooked in, and it tends to make the code into a mess, and then you end up putting in a bunch of hacks to make it possible. If there are enough people interested in it, like I said, I'll send out a form and see. But if there are, then I think we could do that. There's no reason not to. It's kind of a fun thing to build. It's just a little bit of time. But I think the way that our systems will be set up, it won't be too hard to implement that either. So it's definitely something interesting, and it's a really good idea. So I liked it, and even if people don't want it, I might just kind of figure out a way to squeeze it in there. Um, Next question that came up was troubleshoot that or sorry, what's your troubleshooting process when you encounter a bug that you don't understand? By the way, can everybody hear me okay? I didn't even think to check. Um, is my mic working, or am I just? Yeah, I think it's working. Good. It's going up and down at least. Um, so, what's your troubleshooting process when you encounter a bug that you don't understand at all? I thought this was great because I used to get really stuck when I would pop up like a new bug that I was like, I have no idea what's going on. I don't know why this doesn't work. Usually not even sure how it's supposed to work or why something's going wrong. And there are two different scenarios for this. If it's code that I've written or somebody on the team has written, the process is quite a bit different than if it's code that's outside of the team. So for our own stuff or my own stuff, what I usually like to do is figure out a spot where I know that, or like if I have a general idea of where something might be going wrong, I'll immediately go in, attach, and put a breakpoint there, and then play and step through and see what's happening. A lot of the time, I'm not really sure, so I'll figure out where the best known point is of like the thing that could be going wrong right before it goes wrong, and then I'll put in breakpoints there and just start stepping through and seeing what's happening. A lot of the time, what I'll find is that if I just read the code, I miss things and I don't realize like a very obvious bug or a very obvious issue that's causing things to blow up or go completely wrong. But if I put in a breakpoint and I just hit F10 and step every single step, just step in, step over, or F11 to step in. By the way, it's F10 to step over a thing, so you can go like execute a line and go to the next one. F11 goes into the method that you're debugging and testing. In fact, I should add a little video on this. And then Shift F11 steps back out of the method. So you can kind of like go all the way through your stack trace and step over every single line. And then you can look in the watch section or just put your mouse over variables and see what's going on. I had to do this yesterday with the system where I was trying to figure something. Actually, I had to do this earlier today. There was a network state bug where um, you would die and you would release your corpse. This is in an MMO. So you'd release to go respawn, and there was an error popping up, and it said, you can't do that at this time. And I was like, what's going on here? I don't know what it is. I'm trying to figure out what's going on. So first thing I did, search for the text. Can't do that right now. I put a breakpoint right there. And then I guess this is another tip, another thing that I do. So I hit the breakpoint, and I was like, I don't know why this is happening. So another option in Writer, another thing you can look at is the stack trace. So it'll show you every caller that's called all the way down to the code that you're on. So I was able to look up and see where it was, and I was like, okay, this is weird. Why is it not right? So it was just that the network state said you were dead, and when you're dead, you can't cast things. That was the bug essentially. But it took me a while to figure out what was going on. I ended up just putting my mouse over the network state and seeing, oh, it says dead. It's looking for I can cast, and dead cannot cast. So I need to go in and change this, either fix the order of when it's getting switched or make it so that I could allow for casting while dead. In the end, I actually ended up allowing myself to cast while dead because there are a couple other scenarios where it just made sense to have a dead player not so much cast a spell on their own. There's another check for that, but to be able to have them apply a buff or a debuff or something to themselves. So there's just some weird scenarios where it made sense to allow that. But that's usually what I'll do, is just a breakpoint and step until I figure it out. If I can't do it that way, every now and then, really rarely, I'll add like some debug logs to see what's going on if I can't get it to figure out, or repro with the breakpoints. The other thing, though, is lots of searching. So if it's stuff that's not in my code, and I can't figure it out just by stepping over it, that's when I start just searching. And then if I don't find an answer within like an hour or two, just looking around online, Googling, then I start resorting to asking friends. If that doesn't work, then I'll wait a day and try again. And one of those processes will usually catch it. I want to do a video, though, on the debugging process, though, and stepping through. I think once our project is a bit more complex, I'll do that. So maybe I'll secretly sneak in a little bug that we can work through, and I'll show you that process of how to debug things. Or as I'm building things up, I always randomly add in little bugs. So maybe I'll just take one of those and just show it instead of showing the good things. Okay, let's see. What was the next question? Since you mentioned not too many questions, I was wondering if you could give a few points on designing a good ability/effect system. I know it'll be covered in depth later in this course, and I want to experiment myself and compare it to yours later on. I'm having a hard time deciding where the logic should go, especially about how my abilities get called. I'm trying to implement abilities that work for various situations where the main ones are auras and on-hit effects, okay? Should my abilities subscribe to respective events on a character class, like on enemy hit or on unit enter range? So for the aura type things, the on enter range thing is it's nearly perfect. Like you want some sort of a trigger like that. A lot of the time it depends on if it's like an AE aura or if it's like a group type thing. If it's a group thing, it's even simpler. But there's another way you can do that too. I'll talk about it in just a second. And then it says, although not sure that would work with my auras, had different range checks for on hit. Its projectile knows that the enemy was hit, not the character or components. Okay. Let me finish this off. Is trying to get required events to sit on the character class the right way? I appreciate some pointers. So I would say the events here. So the question is about two different things. One is aura type buffs, right? So if you have an aura type buff, like you've got your character and you want anybody that comes around them to instantly get this new effect, it's either a buff or a debuff, then you're going to want to use some sort of a range entering event that's firing off based on when things get into a specific range. You can do that through a entity manager type or area of interest type system that just keeps track of when things care about how far they are. Yeah, right. We're not looking at the comment chat here. The live one, the public one will be live in a bit. And then the other thing they do, so a lot of the time these AE type effects are actually ticking, and they're like doing like damage every 3 seconds to everybody around. In that case, I just recalculate out what targets are valid every time it's going to tick. I don't know if I'm supposed to show this. I'm just going to pull it up. Let me pull up the ability editor that I've made for this MMO and just give you an idea of how I like to lay things out. Okay, here's a GM kill one. Perfect, right? So the way I like to make my ability systems is that I've got one ability, and then that has on it any number of different effects. The effects then can be doing any different type of thing, like modifying a pool amount, like, hey, I want to modify mana and give 100 mana, or use some randomness or something like that. And then I'll usually have an AoE option on them so that I can change it and make it, AoE or non AoE. And then it's as simple as going, hey, this is AoE to offensive, and I give it like a minimum range and a maximum range. And the way this would work is it would just fire off, on this one tick, the initial cast, and hit everybody within 5 to 15 meters. There, we're just doing a range check. So we're looking at the cell graph that's got a list of everybody who's within, I don't remember the exact range, but it's within a certain number of chunks away so that it's not too far away. We're not comparing everybody. But we're looking at that and then finding the people in range. And then for aura type things, I don't know if I can show that in here. I've got some, but essentially what we do is instead of making it instant, it should have defaulted to instant, and make it timed, and it would last for a little while, and it would have some number of ticks on it, like it ticks 15 times for every 3 seconds. So this would last for 45 seconds, and then here it could just recalculate these targets. In fact, I have an option in here. I don't know why I don't see it, to actually recalculate the targets every tick. That should be an option. I'm not sure why I don't see it. But then you can either select the targets initially or do it the other way. And then the other one was adding an aura. Acts a little bit different because I actually have an add aura. Is it aura ability? There it is. So it just triggers and it adds an ability to everybody that's in range. And then when they leave range, it removes it. So actually, when I think about it, the way that this actually works in this case is that we'll add the ability to them when they come in range. And then on that player, on their buff controller, we're checking to see if they're in range and then removing it if they leave range. And then re-adding when people rejoin range. I hope that makes sense. Just kind of wanted to show a little bit of an idea of how some of the stuff set up, how I like to set them up so that it's really, really flexible, because I want to let designers do crazy, wild stuff without having to get in there and just constantly make new code or change stuff. I've got like all kinds of, let's see, do I have any JSON abilities? I got lots of them. Let's just find a dot. Oh yeah, so here like just a standard dot. But then you can do like have them be offensive, and then also have things that like, so this does damage to somebody, and then I could have it also buff myself or something so that or heal me or something like that. Like, oh hey, this also heals me for 20 or 20 to 30 or 20 to 25, because I already typed in a 2. You get the idea. So you can have an ability that does all kinds of different things, and you can kind of mix and match and compose them however you want. Let's see. Hopefully that made some sense. The aura is actually handling it itself in that case. So it's handling removing itself when it gets too far out of range from the owner. So it knows it, and it's kind of a special case one so that it can handle that without too much server processing. So it just looks to see the distance to the owner, and if it moves, I think it's set up with an event. It's been a little while since I coded it. I'm pretty sure it's set up with an event. When it moves out of range, it just removes itself. And then when somebody comes back into range, the caster's aura thing adds it. There's an aura controller on each one of them that manages these. In fact, that's one thing I'd recommend, is split that code off, your aura related code, split it off into its own separate class, add that to the player. Same with your buffs and everything else. Get separate classes for all of these. You don't want to mix it in, or else you'll just end up with a giant monolith that gets really hard to work with later. Okay, let's go on to another question real quick. Do you have any experience doing game development where the team is not located together and or working in different time zones? If so, what tools do you use to communicate, version control, and planning follow-up? Do you have real meetings where you get together, etc.? Yes. So I've done that quite a few times, and the project I'm working on now is mostly like that. Most of the people are all over there. Some of them as far as the complete opposite side of the world, over in Australia. And then some are local. There's a couple that are somewhat close, like within an hour, half-hour drive. But most of the time, I don't really meet with them in person. Every couple weeks, we get together. In fact, was it last Wednesday or this Wednesday? Whatever it was. Went and met with them. And then sometime later this week, I'm going to go meet with them again, the local guys. And it's just to talk and kind of get the communication flowing and stuff. It really does help talking to people in person, but it's not mandatory. The thing that I like to do the most that really helps is coding together, doing some pairing online or mobbing online where we're fixing a problem and just kind of working on a problem together. It does a lot of things that really help. It helps kind of build up trust between each other because you know what each other's doing, you know how the code looks, and you're working on things together. It also makes you both or all better. So when you're coding together, as long as everybody feels comfortable and safe, it's very easy to help each other improve and just write better code. There's never been a time where I've been pairing and the code came out worse. It always comes out better. There's always new ideas and new insights. And it also prevents you from taking shortcuts and making messes. When you're working together, it's very easy to call each other out and say, hey, maybe we should do that. Let's just do it the right way. So that's the biggest thing I would recommend is trying to pair. Now for tools, I still just like Trello. There are a bunch of other tools that people like to use. I just generally prefer Trello because I find it easier to manage and faster, and it's not wasting time, and I don't end up with a bunch of people filling in a bunch of nonsense that I have to worry about whether or not it's accurate or not. That's one of the biggest hard parts, I'd say, with remote game development, is that since everybody is not there all together, if you're looking through a big sorry, I was reading a question. If you're looking through a big list of bugs and features and stuff, it's very hard to know, are these real? Like, are these actual, like, active things? Are these still valid? Are these priority or anything else? If you're in a room with everybody else, it's super simple, right? Because you can just go, hey, is it still good? No, wait, what's the next thing? And you can find out, and it kind of helps you bypass the downsides of big systems that end up full of stuff. I've never really found a good use of a giant like bug tracking or feature tracking system that was online that worked great. And it's not because the software is a problem. It's just because the way that people use them is a problem. They fill them up with a whole bunch of stuff, and then things change and don't get updated, right? Unless there are people constantly actively managing it and knowing exactly what's valid and what's not, and making it so that everybody else doesn't have to do it. It's kind of a pain. So, okay, let's see. Next question. At what point do you upgrade to a new editor version? Like, when will you switch your development to 2020.1? Probably as soon as it's ready. So for a live bigger project, it's a bit slower. Wait until it's been probably about a version old, not like 2021, but like 2020.2. Then maybe consider jumping up to 0.1. And that's just because if there are issues, you don't want to burn and blow a bunch of time. The other thing that drives it is when there are new features and functionality. Like in 2019.3, one of the things that we're going to be doing is the addressable system, which is why 19.3 beta is what I'm using right now, because it's important to use it and get into that new system, because the new system is going to make a big difference in what we're doing. So I don't jump as soon as possible, but as early as I feel safe. And most of that is because I don't like being too far behind. I don't like having a bunch of projects that are far behind. I don't like missing functionality. And I don't like having to manage projects that are all in a bunch of different older versions. And things generally, for the most part, get better. Sometimes things will break, but most of the time things just get better. Okay, let's see. Have you planned any talk about how to reuse components you've developed between projects, like an inventory system, character movement controller? Very little. And that's because most of the time I don't end up reusing these things. Because if I'm reusing them, they tend to be a little bit too generic and less optimal. I've done that a lot in the past where I would build up libraries of stuff that I would reuse, and then I would constantly be changing and tweaking these libraries to make them kind of fit into the problems that I was trying to solve. And it never really worked great. There are some little chunks of code that I'll reuse, but most of the times those are just more like snippets, not so much bigger components. And partially that's because I'm not building a lot of the same kind of game. I think when you're in a scenario where you're building, a mobile game every 3 months, or you're building like, a new solitaire version every month, it's very, very important to do that, because you're reusing a lot of functionality and a lot of your gameplay stuff is very similar. In my case, that's almost never happened. Usually the games that we're building, like one game is some mobile thing, the next one some VR multiplayer thing, and then something totally different. It's very rare that I'm bouncing or doing the same kind of development over and over and having components that really mix in there without making them really generic and messy. So I'll talk a little bit about the snippet side though. Um, and I'll show how to do that in Writer a little bit too, because there are some little chunks that I'll reuse, but like I said, it's very very rare, and I think it's mostly just because of the types of games that I tend to work on. Will there be continuous integration and continuous deployment themes in this course? Probably not, but if it's something people are interested in, we could definitely do it. It's not something I thought people would care too much about, but it's something that I really love to do. And that's just a system so that when you commit, a build happens and a deployment happens all automatically so that you don't have to go through the process of, hitting file, build and run or whatever. And it helps a lot for bigger games where you have to deploy out to servers and everything else. So I may just kind of add that on near the end as a thing so we can just do deployments easily. I'm not completely sure how it'll fit in, but it's something worth considering. At the very least, I could definitely do some videos on it because I think it's important. It's a huge time saver. Like anything that you're doing over and over throughout the day should be automated. If you or anything you're doing, I'd say even once a day, if you can automate it, you probably should because you're going to save time in the long run, save headache, and you avoid mistakes. You avoid all the manual mistakes. This is one of the things that I did. One of the first things I did when I joined that Vanguard team was redo the deployment system or the build system, not the deployment system. So the continuous integration system, and that was because it was manual for quite a while. There were it was kind of broken and there were a lot of manual steps in there. And it was very easy to break things and people would occasionally do it and forget a step or do it and typo something and break things, including myself. And I was like, okay, let's see if we can automate this. And this was a long time ago, wasn't very good at it, but it still helped a lot. The end result was that our builds got quite a bit faster and a whole lot easier. People just went to a page, hit a button, and a build kicked off. That was all they had to do. We for a little while had it auto building on commits, but back then the builds were just so long that it didn't help a lot because the builds were like an hour and a half minimum, and that was after speeding them up. They were like 3 or 4 hours before that. How long will this course be? It's months. We've got a ton to cover. Right now, we've been hitting a lot of the fundamental stuff on interfaces and abstraction and everything. So we've got to go quite a long way to get to like a full big architected project. But I'm trying to kind of pace everything and watching what everybody's doing to see where we're at. And I want to make sure that I'm not going too fast and losing anybody too. So one of the things, if you guys are all caught up, make sure that you filled out that last quiz because I'm going to go through especially the essay question and just kind of get a really good feel of where everybody's at. So I want to make sure that we're all understanding what's going on. As soon as I introduce the next advanced thing and we start adding more and more, I don't want people to get lost. So I expect, months of just lessons. So I've got a whole ton of them planned out. So it's going to be a while. Hopefully that's okay. It's just going to keep coming and coming. And then let's see, there are many topics that are not about master architect, okay, but are about programming for beginners. Don't you think it's better to split this and make another course for beginners to keep the course who have some experience programming and all that stuff? Yes, and yeah. I mean, that's partially why there's the other course included for free because it's supposed to cover a lot of those basics. It's just that these first couple lessons, since the interfaces and abstract classes are so important to what we're going to be doing and to having good, clean architecture, we just want to make sure that everybody understands it. We need it for swapping in our unit tests and just for keeping things clean and extensible. Like the benefit that you get from proper use of these things is enormous. If you like lightly understand them and know what they are, but don't really know when to use them or exactly how to use them, they don't give nearly the payoff. They just seem like a neat little extra complication, but they don't really add a ton. We really have to understand that stuff in depth before we can get too deep. But I think hopefully after these essay questions and everybody's got these really important concepts down, we can just go a lot faster and a lot deeper. But I found that, I mean, I've met lots of game programmers who've been working for 5+ years who've never written an interface before or never used an abstract class before because they get so used to these patterns. Like they can build a game, but they're not used to building with some of these core fundamental building blocks that really make things easy to use and make it a lot easier to just build stuff. So hopefully that answers the question. Let's see. I'm gonna look through chat real quick. Audio is good. Okay, I want to ask if you have any recommendations for learning 3D math for game dev, a book, a course, a project, or anything. I don't know if I have a really good. I mean, I had some that I've looked at before, but I don't have them memorized or bookmarked. I can definitely find some, or some of the ones that I've used in the past, and recommend those. Like the Catlight Coding is a good blog for stuff like that, but it didn't. I don't remember exact article, so I'll dig some up and show you the ones that I've used in the past that were really helpful. Also, even just going through, surprisingly enough, the Khan Academy stuff is pretty helpful. My daughter was going back through more advanced math last year, and I had to help her go through it. And I was just kind of watching, and I was like, "Oh, he does a really good job of explaining these things visually, how to do vector math and everything else." So it was pretty cool. But I'll see if I can get together a good list on it. Let's see. Talking over email about multiplayer and if we'll be using one and which one in particular. So for this, I don't think we're gonna put in any multiplayer network, but I think I'll do something else after this where we'll dive into building out an actual multiplayer networking layer. The biggest reason is that the Unity ones keep getting killed, like Unet obviously got deprecated. They're building out a new one, but it's not, from what I've seen, anywhere near ready or done. It was all built around making it so that the ECS multiplayer demo could work, not so much that the networking library was good or easy to use. So I want to kind of see where they go with it and get an idea if it's going to be something that's long-term usable or if we just need to go with a fresh new system. Like for Pantheon, we've got a custom system that's getting swapped in that's all built on top of GNet, which is really fast and doesn't generate any garbage allocation. It works great for this kind of game. Depending on the kind of game, you can get away with less than perfect solutions. I mean, a lot of games don't have a very perfect networking solution. They just use the best thing that they have, and it generates some garbage and isn't as fast as possible. So they end up limiting the number of players to like 16 or 24 or 100 or whatever. Ideally, you want to have a system that can do as many players as you want because it's super scalable and really, really fast. And you want to be limited not by the network layer, but by your game code instead. That's where I'd like to go with it, but I really want to see what they do with the final Unet replacement and see if it's worth going into that or not, or if we just need to build something separate. Let's see. I use the iMover interface for my player on the first project of the mastery course for switching the iMover. The best choice to implement everything, the iMover, even the saw blade. Possibly. In that case, for the mastery course, the more beginner one, it's probably a little bit of overkill for it just because you don't really need to swap these things in and out, but there's no real harm in it either. So if you want to get used to using interfaces, I would say, yeah, definitely just swap them in there and play with it. The bigger payoff comes when we start substituting things and replacing things. So when we start substituting our movers and changing the way they move, like with the one example of the nav mesh mover, if we want to be able to, so imagine like we've got a player and we want the player to be able to be first person controlled, or we want the player to be charmed like they're a pet so that they're controlled by something completely different. In that case, the mover's totally separated, or maybe the input separated depending on how we've set it up. Or we want them to do like a movement where they leap over to something, right? They've got a special ability where they don't run, but they do like a flying arc and they do a jump, or they jump back, or they do some other different type of movement. And we want to be able to swap that in without really building up a giant mover class that's super complicated and checks a bunch of switch statements and if statements. We just say, hey, use this other mover, and when we're done, we swap it back to the normal one, and then our classes can be small and easily contained, and it's a lot easier to add things in. If you've ever built one where you've got 5 different types of movement and they're all in one thing, you see the giant mess of if statements and switches and stuff. Yeah, or Cole just mentioned a tutorial mover that just moves it along with the tutorial. So those kinds of things really help. For the 2D stuff like the saw blade, I would say if you're going to do it, do it and then try swapping in a new implementation that just works a little bit different, that maybe adds some randomness or does something else a little bit differently than the normal one. Because I think it's good practice. One thing about interfaces I wanted to ask: when would you include a function prototype in an interface rather than an abstract class? Maybe you know this from your video. Okay, so the difference here for an abstract class, I'd only use it when there's going to be shared functionality that's not going to change between the implementations. So if I've got, well, I guess here you're saying like, not the implementation, but just the prototype of it in the interface. In that case, it's when I have that abstract class that already has shared functionality and I want to force the other thing to implement it. And I don't necessarily want to add an interface to it because it's part of that abstract class, because everything that's inheriting that abstract class should use it. A lot of the time, what happens is I'll have shared functionality in a method that's public on that abstract class that then calls into a protected one that's just declared there, so that everything has to implement how it handles part of the functionality, but then there's the big chunk that's done by the public method. So I'd have like a public method that's like for a really simple example, like a use method that resets a timer and maybe sends a message or something. And then how it's used, what it does when it's used is completely different. So then we could do that on the subclass. I hope that made sense. And that's kind of where I tend to go with those things. Let's see, what other questions? Do we have anything else in here? I've been talking kind of fast. And there weren't many in here in the form. It's okay. If we run out of questions, I'll eat faster and then go to the other live one, and we'll just talk about MMO development. All right, I'm just gonna sit here silently. Anybody got anything else in chat? I'll give it another minute. Just waiting for the delay. Okay. Okay, so okay, cool. Gerald interested in the tutorial stuff, sweet. And then Cole saying, what was the tool that I showed written in? That's actually in WPF, the Windows Presentation Foundation. And it's just because it's easy to build database driven tools in stuff like that. So it's like a here, I can pull it up real quick. I mean, it's somewhat secret, but it's really just a design tool. And I know people don't usually see design tools, and nobody can get into it. It's super locked down. So like it gives me the ability to define whatever type, and this is again using abstract classes. So I have an abstract class for all of my data objects, which is all this kind of stuff that's in here, and go in and search and find, edit whatever types of entries I want. The other thing that's nice about it is, since it's an abstract class system that's set up using reflection, I don't have to add all of this stuff. It's mostly just automatic. Like if I want to go like add in a new different type of thing, like what's one I added recently? I know I added one just a couple days ago. I'm trying to think of what it was. It was, let's see. Oh, entity type. So I wanted to add entity types. So we could specify generic entity types by, designers could go in and create them. All I had to do is make the class, register the repository, and create the database tables, and it's done. Like the editor works, the forms work, everything just kind of automatically happens. And that's where I like to go with the tools, try to get as much of it automated as possible. And then when it gets to more complex things like NPCs, make myself a special system or a special form so that I can go in and edit them and make adjustments and have it all updated. And these ones, like these custom forms, take some time. Like this is probably like a week to build up this form and get it somewhat good. It's still not perfect. But the other ones, it's like an hour. So if it's something really simple, and just create the data model, have it all kind of auto wire up and work. And then these also work exactly the same on the game side. So same data model, just copy it over, and then the server can pull them all in, cache everything, and reload them on the fly as needed. So let's see what else we got. Would it be better to finish the mastery course first? I would say no. Just do them. I mean, it's good to finish it first, but I wouldn't wait. I would just do both, like go side by side, if you can, if you feel comfortable. If not, if you get lost, then go with the mastery course first. But otherwise, I'd say yeah, just do them both side by side. Let's see. Action systems seem pretty cool. How about bringing scriptable objects so designers could adjust them easily? That's definitely an option depending on the scale of stuff. So, for example, in the one I showed, like scriptable objects just aren't really an option because the turnaround time on building stuff and getting that to a server is extremely slow. I really like having the ability to just let designers work directly in a database and then have that automatically populate out to whatever servers they want without having to do any work. So they can just go in, change it, hit a button in game, and their data is updated. They don't have to stop playing, do a build, commit a scriptable object or anything. In a smaller scale, though, where you don't have a bunch of designers and a project that takes half an hour to an hour to get out and deploy, scriptable objects are a great option. And that's what we're going to do later on as we're building this stuff out. We're going to use scriptable objects because it's a single player game. We don't have a database and we don't want to add in extra complexity that we don't need. But for a bigger thing like an MMO, I would always go with some sort of a database type system where the data is not necessarily stored in the game build and is separated out. And it can get compiled down into the build. That's what EQ2 used to do. We would put everything into this database, or wasn't really a database. It was these files. It was kind of a weird mix-up system, and then it would get compiled down at the build so that they could work with it, and then they could work locally, which was okay. So they could see their stuff locally. It was a bit of a turnaround time. Sharing it with people though was slow. Like the turnaround time for that just took too long. The other people had to either sync all these files and then run locally themselves, or something else. You couldn't just get onto a server and easily change the data. So it depends on the type of system that you're building, I guess. But scriptable objects are great for something that's single player. Let's see. Are what we're building ready for modding? No, I don't think so. I mean, it's not too hard to make it moddable with the addressable system. But it wasn't something I'd considered adding because it wasn't something I thought people would be too interested in. It's a relatively complex topic. But yeah, we could. It looks like there is some interest in it. The next two comments are, yeah, I'd be interested in that. So let me think about that and see if that's an option we can do. And why do you think a lot of game companies use C++ in development and create their own engines rather than Unity? Unreal seems a lot more common in game companies, but indie devs and schools use Unity. That's a good question. The biggest reason is that the bigger game companies have been around for a very long time. And at the time, there weren't options, right? There was no game engine that could handle MMO development or even just big AAA development outside of eventually Unreal and CryEngine and a couple others that started popping up. A lot of companies built their own systems because it was needed. It was mandatory. They had to do it, and they needed full control over it because they were building out to consoles that had very specific requirements, and they built games that just weren't super generalized. Now, a lot of the game genres are pretty well known. Like if you want to build a first-person shooter, most people know how to build that, and the engines that exist can all do that really well. Same with like a role-playing game or almost any other kind of game. And a lot of like I said, the bigger companies already have a lot of time and money invested. They have tools built around it. So like that one tool that I showed you there, some of these bigger companies, they've got dozens of tools that all work with their engine. They also have an entire teams that their knowledge base is really heavily focused on their internal engines. So switching engines is a big cost for a very small benefit for them. Newer companies starting up, it does not make sense to build their own engine for, I'd say 99% of them, just because the engines that exist can already do the stuff that they want to do. And this other window, the other chat is distracting me. But the engines that exist now can already do all of the things that people want to do. So they don't necessarily need to go in and create something from scratch. And a lot of bigger companies go to Unreal too because it was still there first, and almost all of the custom engine work is C++, and the C++ programmers don't want to switch to another language because they're already having to switch to a new engine. Why would they want to switch to another language? So that's, I'd say, the biggest reason. And then the schools in India start up with Unity just because it does pretty much everything that you need to do. It does all the things that Unreal does or any of the other engines, the custom engines can do, and it's easier to get started with. And I mean, if we're being honest, like Unreal and Unity generally are dramatically better than any in-house engine. Like in-house engines are very good at specific little things that they do that are unique to their game, but they tend to be a lot more of a, I'd say, a nightmare to work with for both programmers and designers and even artists. When they want to add in new features and new functionality, it's a big long turnaround because they have to recreate things that these giant engine teams are doing. So yeah, it's just there's not a real benefit for them to switch. Is the main reason. Eventually, a lot of them will and do. I've seen quite a few of them go from their own custom stuff to Unreal or Unity, but it takes time, and without a real good cost benefit, like there's no reason for them to make the jump. Like I said, with all their teams trained on the tools and the engine, making a jump is huge because you don't just have to retrain the programmers, you got to retrain the artists, the designers, and everything else. Okay, anything else? When it comes to new games, do you reuse mini systems you built before, or and upgrade and modify them anew, or do you how much you use third party stuff? Like I was saying earlier, I generally don't reuse very much most of the time because it just isn't applicable. Like I'll find things and it's like, yeah, these don't really apply. So sorry, we're watching this other chat. So yeah, as I say, they don't really apply. So it's just I totally lost my train of thought. Too many chat windows going on. um, yeah, the code just generally doesn't apply to new things. So I just don't reuse them most of the time because the systems have to change too much, and it's easier to recreate them. And I also don't work on the same kind of game back to back very often. And then as for third-party stuff, I use them sometimes. Depends on the problem. A lot of time I'll see if I can swap them out if I need to, or if I can swap them out with custom stuff and it makes sense, I will. But a lot of time I'll start with third-party stuff and see how that's built and how it works together. Let's see what else we got here. Okay, Mark wants to hear about character customization. That's something we can talk about. It's not something I've done a lot of, but I know a lot of people who do a lot of like facial and body character customization. We could definitely get into that. I don't think I could hit it right now though. Let's see. And Unity's in C++ with C# interface. What does it change with performance? Not a lot. I mean, really, the C# isn't like a lot of time people just assume that it's going to be slower or something because it's in C#. It's certainly possible to write slow C# code, but it's also very easy to write bad, slow C++ code. The biggest thing it changes with performance is, like I mentioned right below, is garbage collection can be an issue. You have to be really aware of it and watch out for it and do what you can to avoid it. It depends on the scenario. Sometimes there are games where it doesn't matter. You can allocate some garbage, you can reload the scene and have a pause, and it's not going to make any difference at all. I'd say that's the case for probably at least half the games out there. The other half, if it's something endless or something where you're not reloading, you don't have these natural breaks to clean things up, you have to really stop yourself from allocating things or pre-allocate and reuse things. A lot of that is as simple as pooling, but it's also just profiling, looking for where you're allocating and then killing those allocations as much as possible. Makes a lot of sense. There are things you don't learn with Unity, though, like calculating collisions, bounding boxes. Do you recommend practicing calculating these manually? Not really. You can if it's something that's interesting. You definitely can do it. It's just that you don't really need to do it very often. It's very, very rare that anybody needs to resolve a lot of the problems that are already solved in the physics system. It's good to understand how they work and have a general knowledge of it, but it's not going to make you necessarily any better at what you're doing. It's not going to help you get things done faster or get your game any better if you just know kind of how to rewrite the low level stuff. Using the stuff that's there tends to just be better and save you time and let you focus more on keeping things clean. A lot of the time I'll see people who focus heavily on those kinds of details. Like they'll focus on some low level little thing, and then the rest of the code is just a giant nightmare. They're like, I did this one little I spent weeks getting this rewriting this one thing that already exists, and then the rest of the code is just bad because they're not focusing on the big picture. They're focusing in on one little problem. So it's neat to learn. It's good to know, but I wouldn't like make that a priority or anything. And yeah, we'll definitely touch on LOD systems and just rendering optimizations when we get a little bit further on, once we actually have some art assets and stuff in the project. Cool. Well, it looks like questions are almost up, and I need to go eat real quick before we go live on the other stream. So if you guys have more questions, just send me an email, and I'll get to them as soon as possible, and then kick off the other live stream probably a few minutes early. I'm just going to go eat real quick and then start that one up. But thanks again, and just send me an email if you guys have any other questions that I missed or anything that comes up after.